is going to be my project for the book that we talked and read about in Are We Born Racist? And the concept that I have going on right now is it can be really stressful, not only school and everything, but also it can make people uncomfortable to talk about something like racism. So I thought it would be nice to kind of have like a little like color with me type video. So I have colored pencils here that one of my housemates so kindly supplied to me, and I am going to color this beautiful woman here. And the reason why I kind of chose this picture is because I realized as a little girl I never really went out of my comfort zone to actually have different skin tones for the people that I was coloring. Even when I was little, it was always tends to be like the lighter skin tones. So I kind of wanted to have a little bit more representation in something that I did as a kid. And the first thing that I want to talk about as we do this, so as I went through the book, I highlighted a lot of things that really stood out to me. And one of the things that was talked about in one of the first chapters that I think really influenced me was this idea of prejudice versus positive thinking. And some of the quotes that I have pulled up is, "As an African American and as a human being, I find many of the results from these studies dismaying. However, as a social psychologist, I know that there is more to the story." This is talking about the idea of facial expressions, a study that was done. And then another talks about how the term racist has become an epithet in most parts of American society, and later explains that in early studies using psychology to examine interracial attitudes found that during real or imagined interracial interactions, people often showed bodily signs of stress inconsistent with their explicitly stated racial attitudes. It said here that white students would consistently rate potential black partners as favorably or more favorably than potential white partners, but what they explicitly reported was often in direct conflict with their facial expressions. Racial attitudes people explicitly reported on a survey predicted how verbally friendly they were during the interaction. Explicit racial attitudes, implicit racial biases predicted nonverbal behaviors. Body language revealed underlying feelings of stress and discomfort. And then in this idea of like smiling against prejudice, tendency to see guns disappeared when the black faces shown were smiling. So this talks a lot about like this idea of public shootings and stuff like that. And as posing a smile can be enough to produce mild positive emotions and can lead to more favorable evaluations of people. So when black faces were shown smiling, they had a little bit more of a hesitant reaction in this study. And then it says improvements in their ability to recognize faces of a different race decreased implicit racial biases, and that viewed people of a different race as categories instead of as individuals. Inducing a strong positive emotion before recognition task eliminated the cross-race effect. And then some early evidence against smiling more can help reduce racial categorization. And then finally here it says, instead of worrying about the fact that it was interracial interactions, and talking about how like treating their interaction as just an interaction instead of worrying about the fact that it is an interracial interaction. And this talks about like the pull of prejudice. And so I kind of just want to dive into this a little bit more and think about how this specifically kind of like impacted me, and how I kind of see it relating to life today. And so what was really interesting about this term right here, about the fact that like something can be an epithet. So I didn't really know what the word epithet was before reading this, and to be honest, like I still don't know if I really like fully understand it. But like the text kind of goes on to say it is and unusual for it is rare and unusual for someone to openly report bigoted feelings. While a change is welcome, it has caused a slight problem for psychologists who study how stereotypes and prejudice influence behavior. So, like, as I was reading this, the word, like, how I kind of understood epithet is this idea of, like, that it has, like, a deeper, more negative meaning to it. You know, like, people just can't say I'm racist because that means that there's a certain connotation to the word, I would say. I think I want to do this for the lips. And it's really interesting because something that like I've talked a lot to my friends about recently is this idea of like somebody is more worried about being called racist than actually doing or saying the racist thing. Like, their viewpoints don't change because they're called racist, but they don't like the connotation that comes with being called one. And, you know, being called a racist doesn't always mean that that person is going to be willing to change their viewpoints just because you said so. And that kind of goes along with like this idea of how people, like, no matter what their beliefs are, will always state that they're not racist here, which brings up kind of like problems within like psychological studies and this idea of like of reaction, right? Because as people of color, you don't, especially when you walk into spaces where you might feel uncomfortable, it's like, okay, I can feel uncomfortable, but I don't know if this is unsafe for me. And kind of evaluating like if a place is safe or unsafe, or if you're welcomed or, you know, you're not welcomed. A lot of the times that won't come from, you know, the people talking, or even like microaggressions, if they use those when communicating with you. It'll come from like body language more than anything else, and seeing how someone interacts with you or seeing how they interact with different people of color, you're going to get more of an idea of who they actually are. And so like that was just something that was really interesting to me, because as we're living in an era where, you know, we're in COVID now, and like we have kind of lost a little bit of our ability to interpret facial expressions, like body language has been a really important thing. And I think like just that idea of it being like an epithet is something that I guess I never really like, I guess I gave it thought, but I never really knew how to put it into like conscious words. And something too like about this idea that like what people say isn't always what they mean, like it's just something that's really interesting to me, because then what does that mean about our society? What does that mean about what we value, right? So like these questions are kind of running through my head when we talk about race, and it's like, what really matters to you then? Does it matter to you that you're actually being, you know, like promoting the rights of everybody and making everyone feel welcomed, or are you just trying to save face in a sense? And it might be like a negative, more like pessimistic way to think about it, but like while I was reading this, there was no other real way to interpret something like that in a sense. And so then when we kind of keep going and talk about this idea of like smiling through prejudice, at first, honestly, when I was reading through it, I thought it was kind of naive. I thought it was one of those things where it's like, you know, when you're little and you're a kid and you're just like, I want world peace. And you're like, oh, how do you accomplish that, Billy? And they're like, just be nice to each other. And then all the adults are like, yeah, we could just be nice to each other. You know, like it was one of those ideas that I thought was just like really naive. Like, okay, yeah, smiling through prejudice. How much is smiling going to actually help in a sense? And what was really interesting was like the actual studies that had come out kind of like talking about this idea of like how, and like actual studies of how like inducing a strong positive emotion before the recognition task eliminated cross-race effect. So it's like posing a smile can be enough to produce mild positive emotions and can lead to more favorable evaluations of other people. And I kind of grew up with this idea that like I wanted to be a good example of Mexican people. Like growing up, I felt like media representation wasn't very good of Mexican people, and I lived in a small white town, and I thought I had to accomplish this like favorable evaluation of others by, working hard and succeeding, and like of course that was still really important to me, and I'm thankful for it because it got me to the point that I am today. But I guess I just didn't realize how much smiling had an effect on people. And it was really nice because it kind of reminded me about like our humanity and how like, like we're not all really bad human beings just trying to hurt each other. Like sometimes we just need something as simple as smiling to help in a sense. And then like getting into this last section here of this, this idea of like interaction, again, kind of like it kind of goes along to like what I was thinking about in the beginning. But there are so many times when it's like when I see, or like when other people have told me about how they're like, like they made their race a really big deal, and it's not one of those things where it's like the person explicitly said something about their race, but it's just one of those things that like it creates like this awkward tension, I think, between people. And I don't even know if it's like, if it can be skin color, or it can be like an accent, or it can be like an item of clothing from your culture or your ethnicity or your heritage or your race. But there's just something about it that like it stands out more than you as a person. And so instead of them kind of like interacting with you as a person, it feels like they're interacting with you as a person of color or a BIPOC or something within that nature, instead of just a person. And like somebody actually like putting that into words for not only like me and other, like a lot of my friends are people of color, for like us to understand, but for a way that like others that might not have that experience could still understand it. So I think that chapter really resonated with me the most because like I think your journey with race is ongoing, and there's so many things that I still don't know about myself and about race, but it's something that I'm very like passionate about. And so this chapter was just like a really nice way of reflection, but also like as a way to think positively. Sometimes a topic like racism can just be so negative all the time, and obviously because it's racism, like there's nothing good about racism, but you kind of forget that like the people, sometimes like the people around you are genuinely good. So that's why I kind of really liked this chapter and how that was going. And there were so many wonderful things that were talked about in this first section that I could probably like go on and on and on about. So like this idea of like stereotypes, specifically like with me being a student, like this idea of like those who stake their identities in a given domain of achievement are the ones who seem to be affected the most by the negative performance stereotypes in that domain. Stereotypes actually boost the performance of positively stereotyped groups, versus stereotypes don't only perpetuate achievement gaps, they exacerbate them. So this is really interesting because and I think like they talked about it here, but like yeah, this idea of like Asian Americans, immediately like I just thought of all the jokes that like my family would say and all these different things that people would say, and like there's like one of those like, I guess like one of those positive examples, but also it got me thinking about, I live like about an hour from Detroit, and it got me thinking about like kids in the inner cities. And some people may not say like, oh, the black kids in the inner cities are not going to succeed well. But people say like inner city kids just don't have the same resources, they're just not going to be as smart, and like they say all these things, and I don't think they realize, like society realizes the stereotype that places on them, and like this idea, I'm pretty sure they talked about it later, but maybe like this idea of like a self-prophecy. And it's something that I saw a lot with a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's something that I saw with my cousin. So my cousin is still in Mexico, but you know what I mean, like girls down there, just in her area specifically, just don't get a lot of opportunities, and a lot of the friends that she even knows like never really went to college, never really found like a career or something to do. And so for the longest time, like people would tell her that like she wasn't going anywhere, and especially because she has like different, she doesn't have a learning disability, but she just learns differently. But Mexico doesn't always have like those types of resources and like understanding of that kind of culture. And so like for a while, yeah, she really didn't apply herself. She thought like if she was just going to fail, why bother? And so like that was a way that like really held her back, and like thankfully she has been able to move past that. But I was really scared for a second that like because society and like the people around you like voice these stereotypes, these negative stereotypes about you, it's actually going to make you fall into them, and then the positive stereotypes can lift you up. I thought that was just a really interesting idea of like of I guess manifestation in a sense. And it was just like really real to me like as a student, and like my younger brother is still in high school, and with him going into college soon, I've been a lot more conscious of like him going to college and like the stereotypes that can be placed upon him, positive or negative, and how that could affect him. So I just thought that like that idea of stereotypes can actually be beneficial at times was a really interesting thing to kind of look at. And yeah, like everything that had to do with students. And then, oh my goodness, this chapter was amazing. When racism makes us sick. And I was reading this, and like it just hit I understood it in a different sense, because summer of 2016, before my sophomore year of college, I remember all the things that were going on in the news and in the media, and like the protests that were going on, and like the footage that was coming out. And I was happy that people were standing up for what they believed in, and I felt like it was obviously time, like there was enough people getting hurt, and like this idea of like systemic racism, and like just so many things were being brought to the forefront, which was of conversations, which was amazing. But sometimes it could be such a heavy burden that I actually felt physically ill for a few weeks that summer, just because of all the things that were going on in media, and I had to not look at my phone because of it, because I would go on there and I would lose my appetite and I would get headaches, and it was just a really interesting time for me to see how that stress can like build and manifest into somebody. And so this idea of like psychology of powerlessness can wreak havoc on people. So it's about the stressors caused by a society that tolerates leaving so many of its members so far behind. And that's the thing, so many of us are still, so many groups of people of color in the United States are still living like so far behind, and like just kind of still, I guess, in like the outskirts of society, and we just think that that's okay, which is why the Black Lives Matter protests were so important, because it was people standing up and being like, I see what's going on and it's not okay. And I don't know if you're seeing it or not, but even if you're not seeing it, in a way, like that means that you're still allowing it, and that's not okay. So like this idea of like choosing not to be ignorant anymore and actually owning up to what is going on around, or like to with the people around you is really important, but like this is the actual effects that it has on those communities. And what's really interesting too about this is the fact that like some people of color have a harder time accessing healthcare. So, and then sometimes that healthcare doesn't cover psychological services. So all of these things of like documenting health disparities with like groups defined by power imbalances, and like this idea of like the weathering effect that we also talked about in class. And being a minority in a prejudiced society erodes one's health over time, but then those same people aren't getting the resources that they need in order to deal with how stressful these situations can be, and like the negative impacts that this can have on an individual's life. And I think it's just another part of the system that made me think really deeply about it, and something that I had never truly thought about before. And to be honest, I kind of came into this book a bit naive, thinking that like I was gonna know most of the things that were talked about in the book. And you know, although I did know some of these topics, I didn't think about them in the same way that the book is covering them, and that in the way that like these essays are covering them. So it was really like interesting to see that, and you know, kind of remind myself like I'm not done in my journey about learning about these issues. And I don't want to be. It was something that was very like I really enjoyed reading this book and learning about it from a completely different way that I had thought about it before. And so it's so hard to just like pick a few things to talk about, but I have to, or I'm gonna move on, or else I'm gonna not get any further. So part two talks a lot about like overcoming prejudice. So I highlighted a few things in the introduction there. And what's really interesting about this second part is that it talks about like schools, talks about color blindness, and it talks about police bias. And those are all topics that I'm very passionate about. So I think I'm obviously just only having to pick a couple. But how to talk with kids about race, I think is something that's really important. And some of the things that I highlighted in this chapter that I kind of want to point out is like, doesn't mean that kids this young understand race in the same way that adults do, nor does it mean they're burgeoning racist. Kids' views only become prejudiced when they start linking these traits to flaws in character behavior. We adults are the ones who ascribe malice to simply noticing racial differences. And I thought the word choice of flaws was really interesting here, because in a way, like I was trying to think, I'm like, is there a better word to really describe it? And I really don't think it is, because even going back to like what racism was historically, which was like people actually believed that there was a genetic difference between different races. And it's something that we talked about in class with the case study about intelligence, and like this idea of pseudoscience. Like those are seen as flaws, those are seen as biological flaws that are given to a group of people. And so like using that actual terminology was just really fascinating within this. And then it goes on to say like, we abstain from discussing race with our kids. We may confuse them and implicitly send the message that it is bad or wrong to talk about racial indifferences. They can tell their kids it's okay to recognize and talk about racial differences while still communicating that it's wrong to hold racial prejudices. Answering kids' questions about race may help them understand racial issues and become more tolerant. Still, studying is the best way to talk about it. Provide support and coping skills. Feel pride in their racial or ethnic identity, and pride in how to make sense of differences around them. And I kind of highlighted this big paragraph here, but it really hit home for me. So it said, that means parents should try to avoid making race seem like such a big or intimidating topic that kids believe it's off limits, and they should try not to make kids feel awkward or inappropriate for asking questions. One of the best ways for parents to do this is to practice talking about race with friends, with each other, with colleagues, so they can reduce their own anxiety about discussing these issues with their kids. And so this is really important to me because, and like the way that I was kind of like reading and like some new things that I kind of learned, growing up as a kid of race, of like being biracial, but I also grew up in a community that was very diverse for the first 8 years of my life. And my parents never really talked to me about race, even though my parents are a biracial couple. It never really came up in discussion, I guess, in such a serious tone. I was just like, oh yeah, I have my family in Canada and I have my family in Mexico, and they speak different languages and they maybe look a little different, but who cares, right? Like they were my family, and I thought like it was fun to be of different like parts of the world, I guess. But it wasn't until I actually came to the United States, to Michigan, and experienced my first Martin Luther King Jr. Day, that I realized like I became conscious about race at that time. I don't think I wasn't conscious of it before. I think I knew that my family was of different colors, and I think I knew how I looked in comparison to my peers, but that's the moment I became conscious of like what it actually means to be of a different race. And my mom still has a very distinct memory of me coming home and kind of looking at her and asking her, and like rolling up my sleeve that day and asking her like, Mom, what color am I? I think because like I never had to really think about it before. I just kind of, I don't really know. I can never go back to that moment. But it was just one of those things that like really, really stood out to my mother. And so like thinking about that, and you know, like as we're growing up, like I think we're realizing how little these things are actually talked about, and like how race is a taboo subject, honestly, in our society. And so the idea that like, and you know, like people always ask, they're like, well, how do I bring it up? Like, why do I need to bring it up? Stuff like that. And it's like, I made this comment for class as well, that like kids of color, like I'm obviously like a very like an exception to a lot of people, and my experience is different because of the races that I am. But like for Black children, for example, for Black young men, they have to talk about race from such an early age, and they have to be so conscious of it from such an early age because the system, in a sense, is built against them. Why shouldn't the rest of the United States do them the respect of doing the same thing? Of learning about it, to make sure that they're not actually alone in this. I think like that was something that was really important to me, that I realized, and like this essay like actually gave a solution, and the solution that like is parents, you need to, you know, like step up and do better. Like if we want a better younger generation, we do have to make a better generation than we have now. And you know, like I hear this all the time where it's like, well, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And it's like, yeah, but like, but this isn't one of those things. Like, this isn't a trick. This isn't one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I learned how to do this on the computer today. It's like, I learned how to treat my fellow American citizens with the respect and liberties that they deserve. And so like that's just something that I think is kind of ridiculous when it's brought into like arguments, but I mean, to each their own, in a sense. Like if that's truly what they believe, if it's truly like it would be going too much out of my way, I think my response would be, how about the way that like people of color have to go out of their way for you? But you know, I don't think that would be very responsive to that answer. Ooh, yeah. Promoting tolerances and equality in school, that was very powerful, but I wonder if the chapter that I really like is in here. Police biasing, understanding people. I don't think it's in the it should be in the second portion. Yeah, I don't know where, I can't remember what chapter it was, but something that I want to talk about here, it doesn't actually relate to like this chapter in particular, but there was one chapter in this book where I loved the beginning story that like it opened up with, the beginning prose, and it talking about how like this teacher couldn't get her students like very interested in the topics that they were reading, and like she was trying to engage with them and all this stuff, but it just like wasn't working. And she, you know, like class ended up being dismissed, they left, and you know, like a kid ended up staying behind and explaining to her like, hey, that's not us. You're making something that we're not interested in. You're teaching us something that doesn't represent us. And she was like, but I've never, like, she's like, but I'm not thinking about race. Like she was like, it's not intentional, like I'm not trying to. And he was like, well, maybe that's the point. And I think that was really interesting because, and I don't think I explained it very well, but the point of that story was that she always thought that it was taboo to kind of like think about race and to keep that in mind, when in reality it's what she needed to do for these kids, because these kids had very different experiences than their white counterparts, but all the literature that she was choosing was white males. And this idea of like, what is that perpetrating to these kids? You know what I mean? Like, she's not choosing them because they're white, but she's not choosing them because they're not white, in a sense. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes you do need to put in that extra effort to actually think about race in a way that you can positively implement it, not like tokenize it, but like actually make it a part of the conversation instead of like tearing it down. And I thought that story was really like beautifully written, and it was like one of the highlights to me about this book. But I don't know what chapter it's in, but yes. And then color blindness, I'm going to wrap up the second part with color blindness, even though I would love to talk about police brutality. Color blindness, some of the things that oh, it was actually this one. You ought to quit trying to make us white. It actually was the perils of color blindness. Look at that. I didn't select these stories because on the basis of their race. Maybe you should have. And so I hadn't deliberately included them either. Color blindness may cause more rather than less racial bias, a result that echoes other research findings. Achieving true color blindness is virtually impossible. It's to avoid the appearance of racism. Whites simply would not risk being perceived as racist, even though ignoring race in the game negatively affected their performance and their interaction with their partner. Interpreted by blacks as signs of prejudice, a colorblind perspective exacerbates racial divisions. And then the last, tolerance results from seeing commonalities, but unless we first see ourselves as different, we will never see ourselves as the same. And that was a really, really interesting line to me, because it's not something that we talk about all the time. And it's one of those things that I think is undermined is like, how are we supposed to see how we're alike unless we know how we're different? And at first, like, when you say it out loud, you're like, okay, I'm like, okay, I sound kind of crazy here, but I'm not crazy, mostly because this person also talked about it. This idea that like tolerance results from seeing commonalities, but unless we first see ourselves as different, we will never see ourselves as the same. Like, before you get to really know a person, like, you don't see yourself the same as that person. You see those persons like, oh, we're different. And it's like, it's there. And if you don't acknowledge that you're different people at your core, it's going to be a very awkward interaction. But if you assume that that person's different than you to their core when you first meet them, you're going to find what those differences are, and along the way, you also find the similarities. And I feel like it similarly works with race, where if you go in knowing that somebody is completely different than you, but you try to ignore that fact, that's just going to make it awkward for everybody around. Like, that just simply doesn't work in that way. And I think like the actual pointing out of that, and like colorblindness is something that I'm personally like not new to talking about, but this definitely gave me like a new perspective on it, in a sense, about colorblindness, and this idea that like, hey, colorblindness is like more than I just think it is, right? Because I learned colorblindness in a very, I feel like in like a low level scale, but like the way that they talk about it in this book, it can have such much bigger implications than I think I first understood it to be. And I think also too, it's because I kind of downplayed it. I was like, there's no way that people actually like go in thinking this way or trying to act this way, and you know, like, they do, for better or for worse. Like, people probably have good intentions, but at the end of the day, like, it's not what the community needs. Like, the community doesn't need you to feel like you're the same. The community needs you to value them with their differences, you know what I mean, and respect them even though you're different. So I think like just like that chapter of colorblindness did a really, really great job of highlighting that. And I don't really know where I'm going with this color, but I really wanted to try it out, and now I feel like I've committed to it. So yeah, that is kind of how I would like to wrap up section 2, and then going right along to section 3, strengthening our multiracial society. Water break, stay hydrated. Strengthening all our multiracial society. Success strategies for interracial couples. So, from the things that I've talked about so far, I feel like I have mentioned a couple times that I am in fact interracial. My dad is Canadian, my mom is Mexican, and I was born here in the United States, and it is a very big part of my identity and how I choose to identify myself as a person, because it's a culture that I grew up knowing and loving very much, but also I cannot like deny the importance of my other family. And so being mixed in particular is very important to me. I definitely have grown a lot in that identity, but because of that, this chapter was obviously very interesting to me, because it was like analyzing my parents' relationship. And I don't like this color anymore. We're gonna choose this one. And so, you know, one of the first things that I have highlighted here, that those who would choose such a partnership must be doing so because they are acting out or can't cut it with their own kid, or are trying to prove something that they and their partner must have identity and esteem issues. So it's like talking about like assumptions of interracial marriages in the 1930s through the 1970s. And then here it says, our goal was to figure out what made the relationships work day to day and year to year. Furthermore, we try to identify ways to support people in cross-race relationships. For race awareness, it says, complete strangers may feel that they have an investment in and a right to comment on the couple's relationship. This was very interesting. And then if a particular racial or ethnic community or attitude shapes a person's identity, stepping out of that framework may challenge one's very sense of self. He panicked and thought, I haven't just married her, I married her whole culture. And this was a very funny story as well. So the reason, like, what these things kind of made me think of was there was a YouTube video that I saw a while back, and it was kind of like it was a YouTube video that I saw a while back, and it had to do with like interracial couples, and I guess kind of like analyzing them within the 21st century. And I like found it wild that people still thought that it's not okay to marry or date outside of your race. And I think it's because, like, obviously I grew up with the parents that I didn't really think twice about it. But like actually thinking about it and thinking about all the people that I know that have same race parents, like I'm one of the, like, I really don't know who else to think of that might have biracial parents, like right off the top of my head out of all my friends. And that's one of those things where it's like, I knew that, but I didn't know, I guess I never really processed why. And like actually processing that why of like, oh, it's because people just don't date outside their race, or like some people think that like dating outside their race is weird, and was so interesting to me. And even like one girl, I was talking to her and we were talking about like dating apps, and she was like, yeah, I never said it for like anyone that's not white. And I was like, what? Like, I was just so confused as to why a person would choose that. And the fact that like interracial couples, like in that YouTube video, like those couples talked about the comments that they have, especially if they have children, like the comments that would be made towards them was just absolutely mind-boggling in a sense, because I guess like that was just my own ignorance of like, oh yeah, interracial, like it's a thing and it's fine and like everybody knows about it, but it's not. And I guess in a sense, like I was naive in that sense to think that like this was okay, and like I never thought about it, but like there might be some parents, some or like grandparents that have very old school views and won't let their child or grandchild date outside of their race because of it. So it's like thinking about that too, like were just things that I never really thought about or explored. And this, like, he panicked and thought like, I haven't just married her, I married her whole culture. And that's very true. And I think that's also interesting when it comes to like adopting children that are of a different race than you. I feel like you have to, if you're doing that, you have to make a commitment that like if this child grows up and would like to, you know more about their culture and their race or ethnicity, like you as a parent should allow them to have those resources. And I feel like the same goes for like when you're marrying a different race or a different culture. It's like you have to understand and validate your partner's experience with their culture, their race, or their ethnicity, and just like support them and be there for them and enjoy it in the ways that you can. I think that's just like something that's really, really important. And I don't think it's something that like, especially with hookup culture, something that people don't really realize when they start looking at long-term relationships with people outside of their race, and they're like, whoa, I made a bigger commitment that I could handle. Going right along, My throat is once again dry. So yeah, here, explore each other's cultures and begin to build their own unique one. A white husband enjoys telling the story of how his African-American wife wore heels on a camping trip. My mother wore heels to her first hockey game. It's just, for my brother, it was just like my brother was 5. She walked in with her beautiful heels, and all the other moms were wearing their tennis shoes and their sweatpants. And it's just one of those things where it's like, I look back and like I admire my mom because I was like, oh, she's just like doing her own thing and she's amazing. But I never thought about maybe she felt embarrassed because she didn't know how she was supposed to come to these things, which, knowing my mother, I doubt that, but I know if it were me, I would have thought those things. I would have felt embarrassed for being overdressed to something like that. This says, more racially affirmed, saying that her white partner never tells her that she isn't black enough. That's something that I think, like I talked about earlier, this idea of like validating. And then, wow, if everyone truly loved a person who is black, racism would be intolerable. Again, one of those things that, like, when I read it for the first time, I was like, yeah, that's kind of naive. Like, nobody's gonna love a black person the same way that you do. Like, and like racism will just end that way. Like, in my head, I'm like, if we all truly loved each other, like, and racism would end, like, that just seems like too easy of an answer. But I think too, like, I started thinking and I was like, what does it truly mean to love? And like, especially on Hope College's campus, which is a Christian campus, and we talk about God's love, and it's like, what does that mean? What does it mean to live with God's love and to pass God's love on to others? So, and I realized that actually loving somebody is very rare, and it's something that sometimes like it doesn't come up often, and it's not an easy thing to do. Like, truly loving somebody is not easy, nor is it meant to be easy. But I think because of that, this statement becomes even more powerful, because it's like, if we created the opportunity and we actually push past to do this, this could be achievable. So that was something that just kind of like really stood out to me. And there's more to this chapter, but I think I would also like to talk a little bit more about some of the other chapters within the third part. And this is one of the ones that I very, very strongly want to highlight. And it is, how can you do that to your children? And so the woman starts talking about how she saw history repeating itself. Apologies. And it talked about disparities between black and boys and white boys. And this is pretty long, but I feel like it's important. African American students, mostly boys, are suspended and expelled at 3 times the rate of white ones. 47% of black boys graduate from high school compared to 75% of white male students. And in California today, 40% of African American males between the ages of 18 and 25 are either in jail, on parole, or on probation. That's sad. And I think sometimes, like, when we talk about race, sometimes we undermine the importance of statistics and actually knowing the numbers. And this is just one of those examples of, like, it's important to know the numbers. It's important to know, like, what this is actually doing to, like, people's everyday lives and how this looks within our world. So I just thought that, like, that was really important. And, like, as it goes along, it says, I'd wonder which 4 won't make it. So she's talking about, like, the boys that are in her living room, right? And she's looking at this statistic, and she's looking at all her son's friends that are, like, sitting around the living room, and the thought just kind of hits her of which ones of these boys is gonna have that future, right? Because statistics don't lie. So it's like, which one will have that future? And it kind of goes on to say, like, subject your middle class white kids to the dangers and deprivations that only poor black kids are supposed to be subjected to. And I thought that was really interesting as well. Because it was just one of those things where it's like, it makes me think a lot, because it's like, subject your middle class white kids to the dangers and deprivations that only poor black kids are supposed to be subjected to. Like, that was the meaning behind everything. And this idea of like supposed to, and it kind of goes back to something that was talked about earlier in the book of like oh, the word escaped me, but oh yeah, about like kind of like being pushed aside and being in like the outskirts of society and being okay with that. And that's why like we feel like sick, right? Going along with that kind of mindset where it's like, why are we, it kind of brings up the point, why are we allowing black kids to be subjected to this? And there's so many fascinating videos I see of professors speaking at conferences, and like one of the very first questions they ask if they're talking about race is, raise your hand, if you're a white student, raise your hand if you would like to switch your race to be a black person, to wake up a black person in America. And so many people don't raise their hands. So many people. And like obviously before that there's like preface questions of like, how many think that racism is like, still happens today? How many think that like people of color are still treated like incorrectly and stuff like that? And you know, like you get a mix of answers, but like nobody raises their hand. Nobody wants to be switched and become black in the United States. But earlier in those questions, they were like, yeah, but racism isn't real. These aren't things that like people face. If they weren't real, you wouldn't be so afraid to switch. At least that's kind of like what I always think about when I watch those kinds of videos. And so like that was just like that was just something that really stood out to me. Like, why do we allow this? How do we know this? And how do we just kind of keep going and be like, oh yeah, this is a thing that's going on in my world? And you know, think that some of them, it's like, okay, like obviously like if I think about it too hard, like I will again become ill. But like some people don't think about it at all, and they're like, oh yeah, black people are treated this way in this country, and then like that's the end of the conversation for them. And I just find that so incredibly, I guess, mind-boggling. I guess like overall this book has just opened my eyes to so many different like ideas and perspectives that I just simply like didn't really think about or have before. And it kind of reminds me of like how to this day how little exposure I get from different points of view, whether that's because I'm at Hope College or the way I grew up, but like overall I just don't get exposure to a lot of these different viewpoints. And you know, like it's on me, it's upon me to go out and learn about these things. And like, yeah, it's hard as a college student trying to, you know, do everything, plus also feel like you have to take on learning and being constantly anti-racist, especially for somebody who's never really thought about or dealt with it before. It's one of those things that is incredibly draining just for the fact that it is incredibly sad. And so yeah, I just find it really, I guess like just really grateful that I read it in a sense, because it did open me up. But anyway, to kind of keep going along with this chapter before I wrap up, every parent has regrets. If I'd raised my kids in a white suburb, I'd have regrets about something else. The default mode is segregation. That's how we got to where we are now. Jesse and Peter were grazed, not wounded by the stray bullets of racism that were aimed at their friends. And then again, a long quote to kind of end this book, and like kind of maybe end my discussion. Parents can teach tolerance at the dinner table and buy their kids toys and take their kids to events that celebrate diversity. They can agitate at their kids' schools for multicultural school boards, faculty, curriculum, textbooks, library collections, and assemblies. They can urge their PTAs to co-sponsor events with inner city PTAs. They can get their kids on to racially mixed sports teams and take their kids to racially mixed after-school care centers and religious services. And the last sentence, I have no doubt that our children are smart enough, resilient enough, and open-hearted enough to meet the challenge. The question is, are we? And it kind of goes along to like that thing I talked about earlier, where it's like you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And it is truly upon all of us. And sometimes like saying it feels a lot more easier than doing it, but this book has kind of just brought it to my attention, like how difficult this really is. And how, yeah, like it is just not the way that we think it is. And so, yeah, I guess that's just something that it's not as easy as we think, but we're each individually capable of doing something. And I think that shouldn't be overlooked either. And so, yeah, there were so many wonderful chapters to this book, and I truly enjoyed reading it. And it's my first time reading like a neuroscience and positive psychology book. It's my first time reading something like this in this format, and I just genuinely really enjoyed it, and I liked being able to put, I guess, like my personal experiences and thoughts and like what I have learned in the past, but also have it really like challenge my mindset and challenge what I know about race, and specifically like in a way too, like I'm kind of surprised because it kind of showed me like what I don't know about white people. And I know it might sound a little odd, but sometimes as a person of color, and especially I think like the Hope College bubble has definitely impacted me in this way, where it's like it's such a small school, and it's so easy to just become so segregated from everybody else. And so like as you kind of go through your education, and like if you kind of like find your group in the beginning, you kind of tend to stick with it or stick to people similarly, and it's hard to break out of that. And especially with a school that is, you know, majority white, if kids come in and they are with majority white students, then they kind of tend to stick with majority white students. But like me, I came in a person of color, and I kind of stuck to the person of color crowd, and I've kind of just been in it ever since. And sometimes when you're in it and you lack that like communication with other people in other like places and lenses on campus, you lose that ability to actually like have those conversations and like actually have your viewpoint questioned by like the real people around you, instead of just like things that you read about on social media or things that you tweet, or you know, things that are talked about in different news sources. I guess it's like just like having somebody challenge my idea in person in a way that was like respectful and kind and still validating, and like we both genuinely learned something from it, is just something that I can't remember doing anymore. And you know, COVID has made that difficult, and you know, like the conversation about race changes so often, and it's never the same twice. But it's just such a fascinating thing to be a part of and to witness and to be passionate about during this time. And yeah, it's just one of those things where I'm just like, it's just constantly growing, and that's why it's important to have conversations, to question, to judge, because if you don't go out and you don't learn about the other perspective and you're constantly knowing about how your perspective grows, how are you going to know where the other person is? And so like you're going to talk to them like they're here when they've actually grown, or they're like in a completely different scale. And so like I think that's the thing that is important about communicating. It's the fact that if you don't communicate, how are you supposed to know? And that goes both ways. You know, like I think we talk about it a lot when it comes to the white population, but I do truly think it goes both ways. And I am trying to color her skin in darker because I did not like how the first coat came out. But yeah, the book was just absolutely fascinating. I'm so glad I read it. I definitely want like my brother to read it before he goes to college. You know, and he isn't as passionate about race, about learning about it like as a field and how it, you know, affects people as I am, but I still think it's like a very important thing to read, and I think can just bring like a lot of, like I said, interesting perspective that I think my brother who's grown up in an all-white town might need. So yeah, I am kind of happy where this is going. I like the vibrant colors, and I hope to kind of make them flow a little bit more. And I love the lip tint that I chose, and I definitely think that like a darker skin tone looks better, especially like with the bright flowers, and like the color texture as well. Like the color texture is just so curly and natural. I just feel like it wouldn't be right if it wasn't something a little darker. And like, I'm not an artist. If I were an artist, I would be shading it properly and making it look like skin. But I think like even now looking at it, I'm just like, wow, I've never done something like this before. Like I've never just taken a dark color in a coloring box and just been like, this is gonna be the person's skin color now. And it's not a ridiculous color. It's not like dark blue. It's the color is literally just dark umber. It is just brown. It is just a dark brown. But I've just never really done this before. And it's kind of liberating because she looks like the people that I admire and the people that I look for guidance and wisdom. And so, yeah. Are we born racist? Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed my project and my insights.